this is Joanne Dunbar, and I am doing my report presentation on 3 different learning and literacy theories. So I have a Prezi to show to you today, and I am excited to get started. So let's start out with the overarching learning theory. This is the one that I chose. It's the one put forth by Brian Camborne. So first I'm just going to kind of go over some of the background and the history of the theory. As a researcher, Brian Camborne found himself noticing that students who were acquiring information and knowledge in lots of other areas other than reading were showing gaps in their literacy. So he had this question that he set out to answer: why do seemingly normal students sometimes fail to learn to read? So that was kind of the question that he was working with, and as he was doing his doctoral studies, he did some research on language acquisition in preschoolers. So he actually gathered some of that and started just really analyzing that and trying to find the common threads, common denominators, and then he started applying it to the classroom. And he went into a lot of different classrooms and told the teachers, hey, can I just kind of observe your students and see if I can't apply some of these principles to specifically literacy instruction. So I'm just going to dive right into the conditions, what they are. I'm going to apply these principles to something that's pretty common and important cornerstone of literacy learning, which is vocabulary. So I'm just kind of going to look at vocabulary instruction through the lens of each of these conditions and look at some practical tips for applying these concepts specifically to vocabulary instruction. So according to Brian Camborne, in order for optimal learning to occur, like the really deep-seated, long-lasting learning of literacy, these 8 things must be present. So once again, he kind of based this on lots of study of real-life classrooms, and this is what he found. So number 1 is immersion. I'm going to use Camborne himself's description in all of these and then kind of give you my paraphrase or interpretation of what it means. So immersion, according to Camborne, is the state of being saturated by, enveloped in, flooded by, steeped in, or constantly bathed in that which is to be learned. So this concept really deals with the amount, the volume with which a concept or principle is applied, the quantity, if you will. So if you want a learner to really grasp a concept, you really have to expose the learner to that material in a very major way. So an example of this in vocabulary instruction is the more that they're asked to use vocabulary words and practice with them, the more efficient their learning will be. In other words, you can't just give a student a set of words and have them look over it once, twice, or even 3 times and expect them to know it. They've got to be constantly using, looking at, hearing these words if you really want them to learn them. So kind of a teaching example or principle kind of that I think applies this concept is a word wall, because with a word wall, they have the words obviously displayed in the classroom, and usually a lot of times a word wall, the creation of the word wall involves some type of activity or meaning making by the students. So they're doing something with the material and then they're displaying it. And this principle says that the more you as a teacher refer to those words, point them out, use them, the greater the learning will be. Okay, my next condition to talk about is number 2, demonstration. This is a little bit similar to immersion, but different in that this has to do with the students watching the material be used. So according to Camborne, this is the ability to observe, see, hear, witness, experience, feel, study, explore actions and artifacts. So the more that students get exposure to these new vocabulary words used by you, the teacher, and just through the teaching materials that you use, and even other people using the words, the greater the learning will be. So once again, they need that exposure. They need to hear and see the word used correctly. That's a big part of it too. It's not just seeing the word, it's seeing it used in a correct way. Okay. So having the teacher model oral speaking of new vocabulary words is important. Kind of that oral component is something that I definitely wanted to touch on with my students. I make sure to vocally, orally go over the list of words every time we start a new unit of vocabulary, because a lot of times just hearing that word is so tantamount to them learning it, and a lot of times they don't know how to pronounce it. I know in our last vocabulary unit, we had a word queue, as in a line that you stand in, and students are not going to see that word and know how to pronounce it, but it's possible that once they hear the correct way to pronounce it, they'll be like, oh, I heard that word at this time in my life, or they recognize it and understand that they've heard that word before. Number 3 is going to be engagement. So according to Camborne, potential learners must first engage with the demonstration that immersion provides. Engagement also depends on the active participation by the learner, which also involves some risk-taking. Learners can participate actively only if they're prepared to have a go. And so this has to do with the learner, him or herself, using the material. So we've seen them exposed to it, they've seen it over and over again. The frequency with which they are seeing it, hearing it, is high. They're seeing it modeled correctly. Now they're using it themselves. That's where we're at in the process. So practice is definitely super important to being able to learn something new. We can't just give them a list of vocabulary words, show them to the students over and over again, say them ourselves, and then not expect them to use them, for them to say them, for them to write them. They must engage themselves with the material. A Freyer model is definitely a good a teaching application. It's kind of, I would say, a commonly used visual graphic organizer type way for students to practice the use of new words. Usually there's kind of some freedom in what you want to have your students do in the different boxes, but basically there's a circle in the middle, and then there's 4 boxes surrounding the circle, and you can have them do different tasks with the word. Usually it's write the definition in one box, write an example sentence in one box, draw a picture, and sometimes maybe like a non-example, so like synonyms, antonyms, things like that. Okay, so number 4 is expectations. According to Camborne, these are essentially messages that significant others communicate to learners. They're also subtle and powerful coercers of behavior. So we're at the point now where we need to make our expectations clear to students for how we are expecting them to use this content. We can give them all of the first 3 conditions, but if they don't know what they're eventually going to be expected to do with it, they're probably, a lot of them, not going to do it or not going to know what to do. So looking at vocabulary words, they need to know, will I be quizzed on this? Will there be homework on this? When will I be expected to know this in the future? And I'm going to kind of talk about that a little bit more with some of the other conditions about future use. But I try to make it clear to my students that I want you to learn these so that you can use them and so that you can know what they mean when you encounter them. That's kind of that real life application component too. So we want students to understand how they're going to be expected, not only from us but from others in our lives, how they're going to be expected to know something. So once again, just provide explicit instruction in exactly what you want students to do with the vocabulary words. If they're filling out a Freyer model, show them how. tell them what to do. Number 5 is responsibility. According to Camborne, learners are permitted to make some decisions, i.e. take responsibility about what they'll engage with and what they'll ignore. So we want to give students some type of autonomy to be able to use these concepts in a way that they choose. That kind of gives them some ownership, and that's kind of real life. We're not always going to be giving students explicit, this is what I want you to do with the things that we're teaching them. We want them to be able to take ownership of these things and use them in a way that's relevant and meaningful in their own lives. So having students come up with their own example sentences for vocabulary definitely gives them some freedom in choosing how they will use the words. I think that's an important one, is even if it's just a sentence, allowing them some creativity in making something of their own with the words. And for my teaching idea, I kind of took that a little bit farther, having them create cartoons or stories, so maybe a storyboard or a cartoon strip that they're making, but they're using the words. I know in my class we did, during Halloween season recently, we did spooky stories, so they had to come up with a spooky story using at least 5 of their vocabulary words. And I allowed them to choose any of the words that we've learned so far this year. I know on Public Safety Appreciation Week, I had them write letters to our school resource officer, and once again I said you can use any of the vocabulary words that we've learned this year so far, but you need to put at least 3 of them in there. And the finished product, I was pretty impressed. Obviously there were some slight misuses of the words in the sentences and some syntactic errors, but it actually made me really proud to see the way that students were really taking ownership in their use of these words, and it kind of gave them some freedom to choose which words they wanted to use, how they wanted to use them, and so on and so forth. So that's an important foundation to any kind of learning, is that freedom and responsibility to use it with choice. Number 6 is approximations. When learning to talk, learner talkers are not expected to wait until they have language fully under control before they're allowed to use it. So once again, that's kind of where he's applying the concept of learning to talk to overarching learning in general. So obviously, when we teach something to students, we understand that they're not going to be perfect at it at first, and that's an important message to convey to them, that they are allowed to try and not get it quite right. I think that's definitely a foundational message that you want as a teacher of anything. You want to convey that to your students, that you want them to try and they will not be unsafe for failing, especially not at first. I remember in my own schooling, when I took Spanish 1 in high school, one of the first things that my teacher said on the first day of school was, in Spanish, you're going to feel silly a lot of the time, and you're going to pronounce things wrong, and you're going to feel uncomfortable because you're learning a new language and you're making sounds that you're not used to make, and you're not sure if you're doing it right, and you need to embrace that because that is part of the beauty of learning a language. And that's something that stuck with me, obviously, that she was right off the bat giving us the freedom to be able to mess it up at first, as long as we were trying to get it better and trying to get it right. So obviously I want my students to practice their vocabulary even if they haven't fully mastered it. I know that on one of the previous slides I mentioned using sentences not quite correctly. I see some using nouns as other parts of speech. I know that fidelity is an example of a vocabulary word that my students have learned, and they haven't quite gotten how to put it into a sentence grammar-wise. They want to use it as an adjective. I had a very fidelity weekend, or you need to be fidelity and let me trust you. And they understand that fidelity means trustworthy, faithful, but they're not quite understanding the syntactical placement in a sentence of that word. So that's something where I can have opportunities to kind of shape this and correct it, but they're not going to get it right at first, and that is okay because I want them to practice with it. Allowing students to self-check. So every time we have a homework assignment, I go through the answers, and this is just my own personal practice, but I don't take an accuracy grade on the homework because to me that's their opportunity to practice it. So it's a completion grade. As long as they do it, they get credit for it, but I go over the right answers and I have them read me what they put. And then we have the opportunity to talk about when they get it wrong, why it's wrong, and have them kind of self-check and self-monitor so they know exactly what they need to study for the upcoming quiz. Number 7 is employment. So as the student becomes more independent with something that they've been learning, they're going to continue to use the material either by themselves or with other people. And I think just depending on what type of personality you have, you may do one or the other more at first, and as you become more confident, you will begin to do the other. For example, a student who's introverted might be really shy to use certain new vocabulary words around others because they're afraid of getting it wrong. But as they become more comfortable using those words in isolation, in their own writing, they are going to be more confident using them in a conversation with somebody else. So both of these types are important as the skill is solidified. So once again, with vocabulary, the students are going to start to use the words if the kind of learning we want for them has occurred. They're going to start using these in their speech and in their writing. And, I'm not so naive as to think that every single word that I've taught to my students, they're going to be using it in conversation by the end of this year. But if from every vocabulary list, they're familiar with half of them and can understand them when they read, and they can use a small handful of them, I feel like I would feel proud for that, because that means that learning is occurring and they are exercising their responsibility by choosing which words that they're going to use. And it's just an important idea to give students opportunities to revisit old vocabulary. That's something that I try to give opportunities for every few weeks. Is give them an assignment where they can use any of the prior vocabulary words, because I think especially in kind of the traditional model that my teaching team uses, we have a vocabulary book and we have a unit with 20 words, and we go through the unit over a course of 2 weeks. We quiz on it, and then we move on to the next unit. It would be very easy for us to kind of just let those prior units fall to the wayside without reinforcing them. And I truly believe that the students need to revisit these older units and these prior past words once in a while, or else it's just going to kind of be a brain dumping where they're going to learn it for the purpose of taking the quiz, going to take the quiz, and then they're going to forget about it. So that's something to keep in mind. And then finally, the 8th condition is response. This is feedback or information that learner talkers receive from the world as a consequence of using their developing knowledge and skills. So this kind of goes back a couple of conditions ago when I was talking about using vocabulary words in speech. But once again, this has to do with using a skill outside of the classroom. I think that's when we can really see this displayed, is that when a student starts to use this material and these vocabulary words in this example outside of the classroom, outside of academic setting, that is truly when they have taken full ownership of it. And that's ultimately what we want. That's ultimately the goal of school, which is easy to lose sight of. Have them bring up words in conversation, at home with their family. you can bring up words in conversation with them to just facilitate this kind of practice, using the words in real life contexts, because vocabulary, the ultimate goal of it obviously is not to pass a quiz, it's to teach students new words that they can use in the real world. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about with the conditions of learning is one technology piece. So I talk about this in my report for class, but Edmodo is an online platform that I'm very familiar with because both of the schools that I have worked at have used it as a regular required tool for communication with students and parents. So it's designed to mimic the format of social media sites, particularly Facebook. It looks a lot like Facebook, but it's specifically for the purpose of communication with students and parents about class. So a teacher creates a class, students join it, and then teachers can use that class page as a tool for posting different information like deadlines, course resources, parent information, and different stuff like that. So I'm just going to kind of take this and quickly apply all the conditions of learning to this particular technology platform, because this is something specifically in my domain. I teach 6th grade, and most of the students when they come to our school have never used Edmodo before, and so it's kind of a big thing for them to learn, big learning curve, and so these are just some different ways of looking at the different stages of their learning of this platform. So the first thing that is very important is if students are going to learn how to use this, they need to be logging on several times a week and looking at it. It's not enough to just get them set up with an account. If they're not actually going to go on and look at it and use it, they're not going to know how to use it. We get a month into school, and I tell the students you need to log into your Edmodo account to access this link, which I do sometimes. Well, if a student has not logged in since that first day when we set up the account, they're probably not even going to remember their login, and they're not going to know where to go. So definitely, immersion is a huge piece of learning something like this. For demonstration, it's important that a teacher models it. So you're going to want to have, the interface up on the screen, maybe have a student log in, and you're guiding the student in what to do. I use this a lot anytime I use some type of new technology platform that I want students to use on their computers in a lab. I have a student log into my computer, and I project it on the screen so everybody can watch to see what they're going to do. Engagement, students are going to need to practice. So this is kind of similar to immersion, but it goes beyond just exposure, and they're going to actually need to use it. They're going to need to join classes. They're going to want to comment on posts. A lot of times when I post homework and stuff, I'll have students respond just saying thanks. And I think that's great because they're practicing how to leave a comment, and they might need to really know that skill at some point. So expectations, this is really an important piece on the part of the teacher because the teacher needs to communicate to students how and at what capacity they're going to need to use this platform. If I'm not consistently mentioning Edmodo to students, like, I'm going to put this on Edmodo tonight if you need it, or I'm going to put a copy of this PowerPoint if you get behind, it's going to be on Edmodo. Check Edmodo this weekend just to make sure that I haven't posted any updates or whatever. However you expect the students to use the platform, you definitely need to make that clear. Responsibility, they do have some autonomy in how they're going to use it. How often are they going to check it? Some students really do prefer to keep a paper agenda for their assignments, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. As long as they're doing the bare minimum, that's what's required to be able to effectively do their best in the class. But some students are going to be on it multiple times a day, and whatever is needed, once again, to be successful in the class is kind of up to the students. So obviously they're going to make some missteps at first. They're going to join the wrong classes. I had a couple students do that. They're going to forget to join a class. inevitably I have a student coming to me halfway through the school year every year saying, I never actually joined your Edmodo page, and now I need to because there's something important on it. Maybe posting a message to the entire group that you should have just sent privately to your teacher. One big one is they want to engage in social interaction through the comments, and I have to kind of correct that. So obviously these things are allowed because this is all part of the learning process, as long as students are willing to be taught and have things corrected for them. Okay. So finally, for the employment and response phase, as they continue to use the platform, the teachers will continue offering those guidances and corrections and interacting with the students. And the more that they use it, the more comfortable they get. And we've used it for lots of different things. I've had them record videos of themselves responding to different prompts or as a culminating project, and then they have to go post it as a comment and then view other students and those types of things. So there's lots of different ways that it can be used. So I'm going to just move right on to Philip Go's simple view of reading. So this is my bottom-up literacy theory that I'm going to talk about. And so now that we've covered this overarching learning theory that I think both of my literacy theories kind of fit well under, we're going to jump right into this bottom-up literacy theory. So some background information. In the 1980s, there were what they called the reading wars, which was kind of this issue of top-down versus bottom-up reading literacy theories were kind of at play, at odds with one another. So there's kind of these two camps. And so Go's theory emerged as an attempt to kind of reconcile these two views. And so we'll kind of see how that plays out, but I'm just going to quickly go through the different components of the theory. It's an information processing model, which means that it tries to explain information acquisition through the lens of what's going on in the brain. So what processes are going on to acquire new information when somebody reads. And so this kind of guides literacy practice in terms of pedagogy. As we understand what's happening in the brain, we can better foster these connections and maybe possibly diagnose learning disabilities and things like that. So the first stage of this process of the simple view involves the visual acquisition of the written text. That means just the eyes looking at the text. So this image of print or just words in general takes it in. The scanner makes sense, so I view a letter and I see the pattern of the letter is that of the letter E. So I know that I'm looking at the letter E. The image of the letter is then stored in the character register, so that visual image of the E is stored and then processed. So that's where my brain thinks this is an E. What sound does an E make? Stage 4 is the code book, and this is where I match the phoneme, which is the representation of sound, to that letter. So I'm thinking E makes an E sound or an S sound. Stage 5 is the phonemic tape. So this is where now that I have seen the letter, I've registered what it means. Now I have a sound that I'm ready to put together with other sounds. Stage 6 is the librarian. So as I'm putting these sounds together, this is now giving me some type of interpretation or meaning making of these letters put together. The lexicon is a storage for meaning held by different words. So this will be like the dictionary for your brain. Okay. Stage 8, the primary memory. So once the meaning is attached to the word, now we're ready to put these together and form sentences. Stage 9 is the syntactic and semantic rules processor. So this is where you're going to find your kind of your shades of meaning, your semantics, your connotations and denotations that are gathered through different combinations of words in sentences. And then this stage, which is this long letter acronym, is the final place that sentences are stored once their meaning is fully comprehended. So this is kind of like the final resting place of a sentence or text. And so this relationship, this paradigm is demonstrated through this equation. So it's decoding times language comprehension equals reading comprehension. So it's kind of the interplay of those two factors. It's not enough to decode, you have to understand a language. So if a person, for example, I can decode Spanish because I learned the different pronunciations, but I don't really understand a lot of Spanish. So since I don't have that language comprehension piece, I could probably read you something in Spanish, and a Spanish-speaking person might be able to understand it, but I myself would not understand it. And once again, you can know a language if I know how to speak Spanish, that's well and good, but if I don't know how to read the text, and specifically talking about learning another language, it might even be more effective for me to draw a parallel with a language that has like a different alphabet. So say Chinese, Mandarin, I don't know any of their alphabet, and so even if I know how to speak the language, if I don't know how to read it, there will not be reading comprehension there. Okay, so we're going to move in to applications for the classroom with a simple view of reading. It's definitely important to keep those two main dimensions in mind, decoding and comprehension, that I was just talking about. So the first teaching tip that I have to talk about is visual representations of letters and their corresponding phonemes are kind of foundational to this. So when you have beginning readers, obviously, because this is a bottom-up theory and it starts kind of with the very building blocks of literacy acquisition and comprehension, you want to start small. So you want to start with matching letters to sounds. Matching letters with pictures of familiar items might strengthen these connections. So you have a card with an A on it, like a flashcard, and then on the other side of the card, let's say there's a picture of an apple. So students can make that connection that apple, the first sound of that is ah, so that letter with that shape makes an ah sound. Okay, so as students start putting words together, it's definitely important to note if we see any learning gaps here. So if there's something where students are not quite getting words in the correct order when they're putting sentences together, this can be a clue that there might be some reading disabilities going on that are going to pop up in the future. Or if there's some, let's say students are understanding, they're reading the word cat and they understand what that means, but they can't read the word, or they can read, maybe they can decode the cat sat down, but they don't actually understand what that means and they're not comprehending that entire sentence. That's definitely an indicator that there might be a learning disability there. Also, something that the simple view does not quite take into account is there are some factors that come into play when learning to read that the simple view simply does not encapsulate. So motivation is one of those, and there have been some studies done that show motivation being a key factor in learning how to read and learning how to read at higher and higher levels. However, there's just not a component of the simple view that takes this into account. So you want to make sure to include lots of elements of choice, creative expression that's going to foster motivation, and make sure not to forget that important piece of it. So one technology application of this view is a program on Smart Exchange. So this is done on a smart board. In Smart Exchange, if you have never encountered it or used it. It's actually really cool. It's a very rich environment of different strategies and programs that can be used on the smartboard. I have used it in the past. I currently have a Promethean board in my classroom, but when I had a smartboard, I used several different programs, and this one is called Spamboni's Eraseroni. So students view a sentence with a word missing, and then they select the correct word that would make sense before a timer runs out. So this has to do with that putting sentences together piece, so the semantics and the syntax, it kind of strengthens that. Alrighty, so I'm going to just move right down into the next theory, which is the top-down theory, Rosenblatt's transactional reader response theory. So once again, the previous theory was a bottom-up theory. This is top-down. So the first, I'm pushing the wrong arrow key. Apologies. The first thing I'll talk about is the background and history of the theory. So this was first put out in her 1938 book, Literature as Exploration. And one of the quotes that kind of encapsulates this view is, "A novel or poem or a play remains merely ink spots on paper until a reader transforms them into a series or a set of meaningful symbols." So basically what this theory is saying is that a text in and of itself carries no meaning apart from the reader who interacts with the text. So of course there's then the intended meaning from the author, but that's powerless without a reader to try and make sense of it. So she starts out by talking about what a reader already knows about a text is going to be a starting point for what kind of interpretation they're going to have. So background knowledge is a huge component of this. I know I see it in, we are reading a novel together in class. It's a historical fiction. It's called Anna is Still Here, and it's about a girl who has lived through the Holocaust. Well, I'm finding that we really have to talk a lot about what students already know about the Holocaust before we even get started in the book, because otherwise they're not really going to understand what's going on if they don't know. This is a girl who's been through the Holocaust, the war is over, and she's dealing with a lot of trauma that she has from what she's been through. And so we talk about that too, like kind of that post-traumatic stress disorder, how people, when they've been through something traumatic, they kind of experience that unfolding in a variety of ways in their lives. And that's definitely something that is important. As a teacher, I can tell you it's very important to kind of jump-starting students' comprehension. Now, there's two different responses that students can have to a text. Efferent responses are factual, so it has everything to do with just getting information out of a text. So student does required reading in order to answer some questions for homework. That is total efferent response. Now, they don't have to be mutually exclusive. Aesthetic responses has everything to do with feelings and emotions. So if a reader is interacting with a text and they were having some type of personal connection to it, that's an aesthetic response. Now, ultimately, I think that it's great when we can accomplish both, when you can get both types of responses from a text, but there are going to be times when students are going to glean strictly an efferent response and strictly an aesthetic response. And reading for pleasure is definitely kind of typically a means to this particular end. We read because we want to have some type of personal connection to a text. We want to be hooked into it. We want to be touched by it somehow. So just some quick applications for the classroom of Rosenblatt's theory. Now, I think this is my favorite theory in terms of talking about applications because there are so many different ways that we can look at the classroom through this lens. And if you think about it, the classroom is a place for reading transactions. Like, it is the arena for these meaningful literary transactions to occur. Obviously, it's not the only place where these things happen. a reader is going to be reading all the time. But this is where these transactions, these connections are strengthened and facilitated. So it's definitely important to keep this in mind anytime that you're having your students do anything with reading. Text connections, excuse me, are something that have been very foundational for me since I've been a reading teacher. It's a pretty simple concept, but you've got text-to-text connections. So how does this text remind me of something else that I've read? Text-to-world connections. How does this remind me of something greater that is going on in the world or that has gone on? Text-to-self connections. This is going to be where you most usually find your aesthetic responses. How does this remind me of my life? How can I personally connect to this? In the past, I've done 2-column think aloud notes where I give sentence starters for a left-hand column, and then as we read together, they are choosing from the list of sentence starters. So this reminds me of I wonder. This makes me think of blank from another class. And so on the right-hand column, they are finishing these sentences. So it kind of like opens that portal for these connections to happen, and makes reading even more meaningful. Literature circles are definitely another way to get students to look at a text through different lenses. In a literature circle, you have different experts over different elements of a text. So one time a student might be the wordsmith, so they're finding new vocabulary and defining those words. Another student might be the discussion director, so asking and recording different response questions to a text that has been read. You might have an illustrator who is drawing pictures of a text. It's helpful to have those roles change throughout doing a literature circle. We're actually my team is planning on, we're going to be reading A Wrinkle in Time next quarter, and we're thinking about doing literature circles with that book, and I'm really excited about it. So some technology ideas for this particular theory. Padlet is one that I've seen colleagues use. I haven't used it myself, but it seems very cool, honestly. It's a platform for online sticky notes, and they kind of have a virtual sticky note wall, so students can post their text connections there and they can see others do this, and this can be used for kind of a virtual exit ticket or a think aloud strategy, so they're making these sticky notes while they're reading. And then Google Drive is one that we have Office 365 at my school, so I haven't used Google Drive, but I know we used it in undergrad, and it was a really powerful tool for reading texts together and responding to it together. So we're making our annotations on a text, and everybody else who's in the document can see what other people are saying. I just think that that is a really powerful communal way to interact with a text. And I'm interested to see if there's an equivalent for Office 365, because that's what my school has. So some special considerations to take into account. English language learners, they kind of have another variable thrown into the mix with the reader response realm, in that they have their knowledge of their native language and their native culture. So this can definitely be helpful in some points. If they're learning new words or a new text or something like that, their valuable experiences and language structures can help them, or it can be a hindrance to things that we might assume that students are going to know. So that's something to keep in mind, that we don't want to make assumptions about somebody's cultural experiences necessarily. And so we want to make sure that all students have a fair starting place to approach a text. And then just keeping in mind that students are going to gain different levels of insight from a text according to their backgrounds and their varying abilities, and that's just a part of good differentiation, is kind of giving students, once again, a good springboard for being able to effectively interact with the text, and just be prepared to scaffold the content as needed. And some will need less and some will need more scaffolding. So, in conclusion, I think that Camborne's conditions serve as a very effective overall framework for learning in general. I already have found myself kind of connecting different practices in my classroom to the different conditions for learning that Camborne set forth. And it can be applied to pretty much any learning situation, because anything you want to filter through it, pretty much all of the conditions should be there. And if they are not, it's an effective challenge to ask yourself, how can I make sure that responsibility is present or engagement is present as I am teaching this? And then the Go and Rosenblatt theories look at literacy through different lenses, but I definitely wouldn't consider them incompatible. And I would say that the places where one of them has gaps, the other one fills in very well. So I think that all three of these theories can be employed in a classroom, and there are certain things that you may want to look at through one lens to get a better picture of what your students need, and some things you may want to look at through a different lens. So that's my presentation. I'm going to quickly go through the references slides just so you can get a look at those. But I've honestly learned so much from, I think honestly the most effective for me of these three theories would be Rosenblatt. I don't know, it's hard to say between Rosenblatt and Camborne. I think Camborne is more of once again, an overarching, effective way to look at things, learning in general. But as a reading teacher, I just think that there's so much wealth of insight to be gained through looking at Rosenblatt's transactional reader response, especially as a middle school reading teacher I'm really looking for ways to get students motivated a lot of the time. We're kind of past the decoding, not that that's not still sometimes an issue, but motivation is really a key thing for me. And so I think that Rosenblatt really puts forth a valuable paradigm for fostering and understanding a love of literacy. So thanks for watching, and I am looking forward to learning more in the semesters to come, and applying what I've learned thus far.